Hey guys, tonight we follow a man who rose from the crowded streets of Brooklyn to stand at the right hand of the most feared mob boss in America. He didn't just survive the mafia life, he thrived in it, climbing from a neighborhood tough kid to the underboss of the Gambino crime family. We're talking about Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, the quiet enforcer who helped run one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. Picture this. It's the late 1980s. New York is a city of shadows, where the five families control unions, construction sites, nightclubs, and entire neighborhoods. While most mobsters bragged about their power, Sammy worked in silence, making moves that brought in millions. He was the man who got things done when others only talked, and he did it all under the watchful eye of John Gotti, the Dapper Don himself. You might think this is just a story about organized crime, but it's really about loyalty, power, and the cost of both. It's about how one man became indispensable to an empire, and what happens when that empire turns on itself. So, before we dive in, hit that like button if you enjoy these late-night mob tales, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and follow me into the New York underworld, where Sammy the Bull learned that in the mob, loyalty could be worth your life, or cost you everything. Brooklyn in the 1940s was a place of contrasts. Streets bustled with working-class families, kids played stickball until the streetlights flickered on, and corner stores served coffee strong enough to keep you awake until morning. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of neighborhood life, another world thrived, one where respect was earned in whispers and trust was traded like currency. Salvatore Gravano was born into this setting in 1945. His parents were Sicilian immigrants who valued hard work, family, and keeping your head down. They never dreamed their quiet, stocky boy would one day be known by a name that would echo through FBI files, news headlines, and courtroom transcripts. From a young age, Sammy was different. In school, teachers noticed he struggled with reading, but excelled in anything hands-on. He wasn't the type to sit still for hours. He learned more on the streets than in the classroom. He had a knack for spotting trouble before it arrived, and for standing his ground when it did. That ability earned him an early kind of respect among other kids. When he was about 10 years old, something happened that would stay with him for life. A group of older boys tried to steal his bicycle. Instead of giving it up, he fought for it. A local wise guy watching from across the street saw the scene play out and chuckled to himself. "That kid's got heart," he reportedly said. It was the kind of offhand comment that would prove prophetic. By the late 1950s, Brooklyn was changing. The old Italian neighborhoods were still tight-knit, but more opportunities, and more temptations, were coming in. Sammy, now a teenager, joined a local street gang. They weren't hardened criminals, at least not yet, but they were moving in that direction. Their activities were small-time, stealing hubcaps, running errands for older guys, and getting into the occasional scuffle with rival groups. Sammy quickly emerged as someone reliable. If you asked him to do something, it got done. He didn't boast, he didn't talk too much, and he understood the value of loyalty, qualities that did not go unnoticed by more serious players in the neighborhood. In those days, the mafia wasn't something you applied to join. You were noticed, watched, tested. A man named Shorty Sparrow, who had connections to the Colombo crime family, began giving Sammy small jobs. It might be delivering a package, keeping an eye on a parked car, or making sure someone's store wasn't bothered by local troublemakers. Sammy learned that in this world, money was rarely the only reward. Earning someone's trust, proving your reliability, that was the real currency. But then came Vietnam. Like many young men of his generation, Sammy was drafted into the U.S. Army in the mid-1960s. He served his time honorably, and the discipline, structure, and leadership skills he picked up would serve him well later, though not in the way the military might have intended. When he returned to Brooklyn, the streets were both familiar and different. Some of the guys he'd known were gone, either locked up or lying in unmarked graves. Others had risen in rank in the organized crime world. Sammy didn't waste time trying to find a regular job. He knew where he fit best, and it wasn't behind a desk. Through Sparrow's crew, Sammy became more involved in construction work, the kind that blended legitimate business with less than legitimate deals. Brooklyn in the 1970s was a hotbed for such opportunities. High-rise apartments, commercial developments, and city contracts meant there was money to be made for those who could navigate the right connections. Sammy was not just a muscle guy. He understood people. He knew when to push, when to back off, and how to negotiate without making it look like negotiation. These qualities brought him into contact with members of the Gambino family, one of the most powerful mafia organizations in America. At first, his work for the Gambinos was indirect. He was still technically with the Colombos through Sparrow, but criminal alliances could shift like the tide. The turning point came when an internal dispute within the Colombos made life complicated for Sammy. Disagreements over territory, profits, and personal loyalties created friction. Around this time, Sammy crossed paths with a Gambino captain named Agnello Neil Della Croce. Della Croce was a legend in the underworld, known for his old-school code and keen eye for talent. He saw in Sammy a rare mix: dependable, low-key, and effective. Under Della Croce's wing, Sammy officially transitioned into the Gambino orbit. This was not a decision made lightly. In that world, changing allegiances could be dangerous. But Sammy managed the move with the right blend of diplomacy and decisiveness. It was in the Gambino family that he would truly rise. In his early years with them, Sammy became involved in labor racketeering, construction, and union-related deals. The mafia had a firm grip on certain trade unions, which allowed them to influence which companies got contracts and at what price. If a developer wanted their building completed on time, without strikes or accidents, they often found it wise to cooperate. Sammy handled these operations smoothly. He didn't rely solely on intimidation. He built relationships. This made him valuable to higher-ups who understood that not every problem could be solved with force. Meanwhile, the leadership of the Gambino family was evolving. Paul Castellano was the boss, having succeeded Carlo Gambino. Castellano preferred to focus on white-collar crimes like racketeering, and was known for avoiding street violence when possible. Some members respected this approach, but others, particularly the more traditional, street-oriented guys, thought he was out of touch. Della Croce, as underboss, kept the peace between the two factions for a time. Sammy watched and learned, absorbing the nuances of power within the family. By the late 1970s, Sammy had his own crew and was making significant money. He had also built a reputation as a problem solver, someone who could be trusted with sensitive matters. His construction business gave him a veneer of legitimacy, and he invested in nightclubs, catering halls, and other ventures. He moved his family to Staten Island, into a comfortable home far from the gritty Brooklyn streets of his youth. Outwardly, he was a successful businessman. Inwardly, he was climbing the ladder of one of the most feared criminal organizations in the country. But power, always, came with risk. As Castellano's leadership grew more controversial, tensions in the Gambino family reached a breaking point. John Gotti, a flashy, ambitious capo from Queens, began to challenge Castellano's authority. Gotti was everything Castellano was not: loud, charismatic, and unafraid to use violence. Sammy found himself in the middle of this brewing storm, his loyalty tested by competing interests. On one hand, Della Croce had always been his mentor. On the other, Gotti's rise seemed inevitable, especially after Della Croce passed away in 1985. Without Della Croce's steady hand, the rift between Gotti's faction and Castellano's supporters widened. Sammy knew that in the mafia, picking the wrong side could be fatal, but he also knew that hesitation could be just as dangerous. As whispers of a move against Castellano grew louder, Sammy understood he was standing at the edge of a major turning point, one that would define the rest of his life. Sammy Gravano had always been a man who noticed details others overlooked. Whether it was a shift in someone's tone or the subtle body language of a nervous associate, he picked up on things quickly. By the late 1970s, those instincts had made him an invaluable figure in the Gambino family's operations. It wasn't just about muscle anymore. Sammy was becoming a trusted decision-maker. the kind of person others came to for advice on delicate matters. The more he proved himself, the closer he moved toward the upper circle of leadership, a place that came with influence but also more dangerous expectations. He began working more closely with the family's leadership on legitimate-looking projects that acted as covers for their other business. Construction was a favorite industry for that. Sammy had a knack for handling contractors, negotiating deals, and keeping projects moving smoothly. On the surface, it looked like he was simply an ambitious businessman who knew how to get things done. Beneath the surface, those projects provided a steady flow of opportunities to earn money quietly and keep the family's power in place. But with more responsibility came more pressure. Disputes between crews could quickly spiral out of control if left unchecked. Sammy found himself in the middle of situations where he had to balance loyalty to friends with loyalty to the organization. That wasn't always easy. In the world he inhabited, personal feelings had to be set aside if they clashed with business interests. The survival of the group, and your own, depended on keeping emotions in check and following the unspoken rules. It was during this time that he began working more often with John Gotti, who was making his own rise within the Gambino ranks. Gotti was charismatic, sharp, and knew how to win people over, but he was also bold in ways that sometimes made older, more cautious members uneasy. Sammy saw in Gotti a mixture of charm and ambition that could be both an asset and a liability. They respected each other's abilities, but Sammy was careful to keep his eyes open, aware that in their world, alliances could shift without warning. When disputes arose in the family's leadership over money, territory, or the handling of certain operations, Sammy often played the role of mediator. His straightforward manner made it hard for people to doubt his word. He didn't speak just to be heard. When he said something, it was because he believed it needed to be said. That quality earned him respect, but it also meant he became more involved in high-stakes decisions. And the higher you climbed, the harder the fall if something went wrong. The early 1980s brought changes to the Gambino family's leadership, and with them came tension. Paul Castellano, the boss at the time, favored a more corporate style of running the family. He avoided unnecessary risks and preferred keeping the organization's activities low profile. That approach worked for some, but for others, it felt too restrictive. Castellano's distance, from certain crews, especially those focused on street-level work, created quiet dissatisfaction. Sammy noticed that cracks were forming in the unity that had kept the family strong. While Sammy continued to manage his construction ventures and other operations, he could feel the mood shifting. Whispers of frustration traveled from one table to another in quiet backrooms. John Gotti, in particular, became the center of more and more attention. He had his own ideas about how things should be run, and he wasn't shy about making them known to those he trusted. Sammy, always careful, listened more than he spoke. In a life where information could be your greatest protection, patience often paid off more than bold moves. Still, there were moments when he couldn't help but wonder how the future would play out. If Castellano's leadership continued to cause unrest, someone might try to change it. In that event, picking the wrong side could mean the end of everything you'd worked for. Sammy knew he had to be ready for any outcome. Then came a series of incidents that made the tension harder to ignore. Certain crews began operating with more independence, sometimes stepping outside the boundaries Castellano had set. There were also personal issues. Castellano's handling of some internal disputes left many feeling slighted. As an underboss in waiting, Gotti was already gathering a network of loyal supporters who saw him as a potential new leader. Sammy observed these developments closely, knowing that if events escalated, the decisions he made would have lasting consequences. In private, Gotti sometimes spoke to Sammy about his frustrations with the current leadership. These weren't casual complaints. They were calculated conversations, the kind you had only with someone you believed you could trust. Sammy listened carefully, weighing each word. He didn't offer blind agreement, but neither did he shut the door on the possibility that change might come. The day eventually came when whispers turned into plans. Word reached Sammy that serious moves were being discussed, the kind of moves you didn't back away from once they were in motion. In their world, an action like that would change everything. If it succeeded, it could lead to a new era in the family. If it failed, it could end with long prison sentences or worse. Sammy had to decide where he stood, and there wasn't much time to think. What tipped the scales was not just ambition, but survival. He understood that staying neutral was often the safest option, until neutrality put you in the crosshairs of both sides. In this case, he realized that refusing to choose would make him a target, no matter who came out on top. He began to quietly align himself with Gotti's faction, offering the kind of logistical support that could make the difference between success and failure. The night it happened, Sammy stayed calm, though the weight of the decision was not lost on him. He knew that once things began, there would be no going back. This wasn't just about a change in leadership. It was about committing to a path that could shape the rest of his life. As the events unfolded, he played his part with the same precision and attention to detail that had served him well in business. When it was over and the dust settled, the Gambino family had a new leader, John Gotti. The change sent ripples through the underworld and beyond, making headlines and drawing more attention than the family had seen in years. Gotti's bold style and open presence in public places marked a shift from Castellano's reserved approach. For Sammy, it meant a promotion and greater influence, but also greater exposure to the risks that came with being part of such a high-profile regime. At first, the partnership between Gotti and Sammy seemed strong. They shared a certain understanding, and Gotti valued Sammy's ability to keep things running smoothly. But the public attention that Gotti attracted brought more scrutiny from law enforcement. Federal agencies began increasing their surveillance, recording conversations, and tracking movements. The kind of privacy the organization once relied on was becoming harder to maintain. Sammy noticed that the spotlight didn't bother Gotti. If anything, he seemed to thrive in it. But for someone like Sammy, who preferred to work quietly and keep a lower profile, the constant attention felt like a liability. Still, loyalty demanded that he support the boss, at least outwardly. Inside, he was already thinking about how to navigate the challenges that would come with the new era of leadership. As the months passed, law enforcement pressure intensified, indictments loomed, and the circle of trusted associates began to shrink as arrests mounted. Sammy continued to handle his responsibilities, but he also kept his options open, knowing that in their world, the line between success and disaster was always razor thin. He had chosen his side once. He might have to do it again. After his sentencing in the ecstasy case, Sammy Gravano began the long and monotonous life of a federal prisoner. It was a stark contrast to the life he had once known. The man who had once dined in New York's finest restaurants, who had been chauffeured through the city with deference from friends and fear from enemies, now woke up to the clang of metal doors and the echo of guards' footsteps in the corridors. In the early years, there was still a flicker of that calculating mind, still weighing angles, still playing out strategies. But there were no more rackets to run, no more crews to command. Time in prison moved differently, slowly at first, then all at once. He thought often about the choices that had led him there. In his quieter moments, alone in his cell, he replayed key events. There was the moment he first agreed to join the Gambinos, the moment he was promoted to underboss, the moment he made the fateful decision to cooperate with the government. That cooperation had spared him a lifetime behind bars in the early 90s, but it had also branded him forever. In the outside world, in the code he had once lived by, there was no worse sin than betrayal. Sammy knew that. He also knew that in the life he had chosen, loyalty was often a one-way street. From time to time, prison guards or inmates would bring up his past. Most knew his name from news reports or documentaries. Some approached him with a kind of curious respect, others with suspicion. He kept to himself, choosing his words carefully, avoiding trouble when possible. The years wore on, and with them, the sharp edges of his public image softened. To younger inmates, he wasn't the feared underboss. He was an older man with stories about a world they had only seen in movies. In prison, stories became currency, and Sammy was rich in them. He could describe in detail the smoky backrooms where decisions that shaped entire neighborhoods were made. He could paint pictures of meetings in dimly lit restaurants where the air was thick with both cigar smoke and tension. But he left out the blood, the details that would turn a story into a confession. Instead, he focused on the personalities, the politics, the constant balancing act between ambition and survival. Over the years, Sammy also began to hear about how the outside world was changing. The streets he once walked no longer looked the same. Many of the old crews had been dismantled. The mafia, at least the version he had known, was fading. Law enforcement had learned the patterns, and technology made secrecy harder to maintain. It wasn't the same game anymore. Part of him felt relief. Another part felt like a chapter of history was closing forever. He also heard about his family. His children had grown into adults during his absences, navigating their own lives in the shadow of his name. There was pain in those relationships, a distance that couldn't be bridged by letters or occasional phone calls. Sammy understood why. His choices had created ripples far beyond his own life. The people closest to him had paid their own prices in ways that didn't make the headlines. In the final stretch of his prison term, Sammy began thinking about what he would do on the outside. By now he was older, his body slower, his health not what it once was. The thought of returning to the old ways didn't appeal to him, not because of fear, but because he knew that era was gone. He imagined living quietly, perhaps telling his story in his own way. There were always people curious about that world, and he knew he could offer a version of it that was honest, without being destructive. When his release finally came, it was without fanfare. There were no waiting crowds, no grand reunions. He stepped out into a world that had moved on without him. The streets were filled with people looking down at glowing screens, not over their shoulders. The restaurants he remembered were gone, replaced by chains or boutiques. The neighborhoods had new faces, new languages. New York was still New York, but it was not the same city he had once ruled from the shadows. Sammy kept his circle small. He knew there were still people who bore grudges, people who had long memories. But there were also those who wanted to hear his version of events, unfiltered. Slowly, he began to speak publicly, first in interviews, later in longer formats. He told stories of loyalty and betrayal, of ambition and consequence. He didn't glamorize the life, but he didn't deny its pull either. He understood its allure, because he had lived it fully. In these later years, Sammy found a strange kind of peace in storytelling. It wasn't about justifying himself or rewriting history. It was about control. Control over his narrative. Control over the way his name would be remembered. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could shape how it was understood. For someone who had once thrived on reading the room and adjusting accordingly, it was a skill that served him well even outside the life. And so, Sammy Gravano, once the feared underboss of the most powerful crime family in America, became something else entirely. He became a living archive of a vanished era, a voice bridging the gap between the smoky rooms of the past and the digital age of the present. He had survived betrayals, convictions, and decades behind bars. He had outlived many of his peers, some of whom had fallen to violence, others to the slow erosion of time. In the quiet moments, away from the cameras and the questions, Sammy would sit and think about all the roads he had taken and all the ones he hadn't. There were regrets, yes, but there was also an undeniable truth. He had lived a life that few could imagine, and fewer still could survive. He knew that history would judge him in its own way, but for now, he was content to tell his side of it, one story at a time, to those willing to listen. Sammy Gravano's story began long before his name was whispered in fear or splashed across headlines. He was born in 1945 in Brooklyn, New York, to a family of Italian immigrants. The neighborhood was tough, a place where every block seemed to have its own set of rules and its own version of justice. People didn't call the police when something went wrong. They handled it themselves, and those who could handle it best often gained the most respect. From an early age, Sammy saw that respect came not from wealth or education, but from strength, loyalty, and reputation. As a child, Sammy was smaller than most kids his age, but he had a stubborn streak that made up for it. One day, when he was about 10 years old, a group of boys stole his bicycle. Instead of walking away, Sammy confronted them. They were older, bigger, and outnumbered him, but he fought anyway. He lost that fight, but something about the way he refused to back down caught the attention of older kids in the neighborhood. They began calling him the Bull, not because he was physically imposing, but because he charged into challenges without hesitation. That nickname would stick for life. School never held much interest for Sammy. The lessons felt disconnected from the reality he saw every day. What mattered to him wasn't algebra or history. It was learning how to navigate the streets, how to earn a place in a world where weakness was punished. He gravitated toward local street gangs, starting small, running errands, delivering messages, keeping lookout. In return, he learned lessons about loyalty, trust, and the unspoken codes that governed their lives. By his teens, Sammy had a clear sense of where his life was heading. The streets rewarded those who could be trusted to get things done. He developed a reputation for being reliable, discreet, and fearless. That reputation caught the eye of local wise guys who worked under the Colombo crime family. They began giving him bigger responsibilities, ones that came with higher stakes. Sammy proved himself over and over, earning their confidence. But even as he found his place in this underworld, he remained deeply tied to his family. He wasn't the kind of man who forgot where he came from. He helped his parents financially when he could, looked out for his sisters, and kept a watchful eye on his neighborhood. This balance between ruthless ambition and personal loyalty would define much of his life. The late 1960s brought change. Organized crime was shifting, and alliances between families could mean the difference between success and ruin. Sammy, always aware of the larger picture, made moves to align himself with people who could offer him greater opportunities. This wasn't betrayal. In his eyes, it was survival. By working with more influential figures, he could ensure that his career in the life would keep moving upward. It was during this period that Sammy became associated with the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful families in the country. The Gambinos valued men who could handle delicate matters quietly and effectively, and Sammy fit the bill perfectly. His calm demeanor made him a natural for situations that required precision and discretion. Through the 1970s, Sammy's influence grew. He became involved in construction rackets, labor unions, and various business ventures that blended legitimate operations with under-the-table dealings. This allowed him to move seamlessly between the worlds of respectable businessmen and hardened criminals. People who met him socially might never guess his true role, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But with success came new dangers. Rivalries between families were always simmering, and even within the same organization, jealousy could be deadly. Sammy knew he had to tread carefully. Trust was rare, and mistakes could be fatal. Yet his ability to read people, to sense their motives and anticipate their moves, kept him a step ahead of those who might want to undermine him. In those days, the code of silence was sacred. Breaking it wasn't just unthinkable, it was unforgivable. Sammy lived by that code, believing it was the foundation of their way of life. His loyalty to the Gambinos deepened, and in return, they continued to promote him. By the early 1980s, he was no longer just another soldier. He was a trusted captain, overseeing crews and managing operations worth millions. Despite the wealth and influence, Sammy kept a relatively modest personal life compared to some of his peers. He didn't flaunt his money recklessly, preferring to invest it in businesses and real estate. This practical mindset made him stand out in a world where many were tempted by flashy cars, expensive jewelry, and high-stakes gambling. Sammy's approach was simple. Grow your influence, secure your family's future, and avoid unnecessary attention. Still, the FBI was watching. Law enforcement had been cracking down on organized crime with new tools like the RICO Act, which allowed them to target entire organizations rather than just individuals. Surveillance, wiretaps, and informants were becoming constant threats. Sammy understood that the landscape was changing, but he also believed his ability to operate quietly would shield him. Behind the scenes, tensions within the Gambino family were building. Power struggles, disagreements over money, and personal rivalries were threatening the stability of the organization. Sammy's skill at navigating these internal conflicts would soon be tested in ways he never imagined. The next few years would bring alliances, betrayals, and choices that would alter the course of his life forever. He didn't know it yet, but the man who had spent his entire life climbing to the top would one day find himself facing an impossible decision, one that would challenge everything he believed about loyalty, honor, and survival. The years rolled forward, and with each one, Sammy's name carried more weight in Brooklyn. The streets recognized him not as a loud figure, but as someone whose quiet resolve could outmatch the bravado of others. He didn't waste words. He acted. That ability to remain calm when tempers flared made him valuable, especially in a world where loyalty was a currency and reputation was everything. By the mid-1970s, he had fully crossed into the life that many only read about in headlines, working closely with men whose names would be whispered in bars and coffee shops. At the time, New York was a city caught between chaos and opportunity. The docks, the unions, the construction industry, they all had their own undercurrents. Sammy began to navigate these waters with an instinct that seemed almost natural. He could read a room quickly, sense when a deal was worth making or when it was better to walk away. This sense didn't come from books or classrooms. It came from experience, from watching faces, listening to tones, and remembering who kept their word and who didn't. One of the most important relationships he built during this period was with Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino family. Paul was a different kind of leader, more business-minded than street-oriented, but he recognized in Sammy a blend of street smarts and discipline. This was not the kind of attention one could take lightly. In that world, being noticed by the top man could open doors or close them forever, depending on how you handled yourself. Sammy worked hard to prove his worth. He took on responsibilities quietly, but delivered results loudly, at least in terms of effectiveness. He oversaw projects, settled disputes, and kept revenue streams flowing. People began to understand that if Sammy was involved, things would get done. This reliability earned him a level of trust, but it also brought him into a closer orbit of men who operated on a scale far beyond small neighborhood crews. Even as his influence grew, Sammy maintained a connection to his roots. He didn't act like someone above the people he came up with. He still met with old friends, still visited familiar haunts. But these moments became rarer, replaced with long hours of meetings, travel, and managing increasingly complex arrangements. His life was evolving, and with each step the stakes grew higher. The late 1970s brought shifts in the landscape. Law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated, using tools and strategies that made the life more complicated. Surveillance was improving, indictments were becoming broader, and the risks of missteps increased. Sammy adapted by becoming more cautious, more deliberate. He understood that recklessness wasn't courage, it was a liability. In the midst of these changes, alliances were forming and fracturing within the Gambino family. Not everyone agreed with Castellano's approach to leadership. Some felt he was too focused on the business side and disconnected from the street soldiers who had built the foundation of the family. Tensions simmered quietly, and while Sammy was not the type to stir trouble, without cause, he paid close attention to these undercurrents. He knew that in this world, shifts in power could happen suddenly, and being unprepared could be fatal. By the early 1980s, the city's skyline was changing, and so was the criminal underworld. The construction industry was booming, and with it came opportunities for those who could control unions and contracts. Sammy was deeply involved in these ventures, using his knowledge of both the streets and the business world to navigate deals that benefited the family. His ability to blend the two worlds made him an asset not only to Castellano, but to others who saw the value in someone who could operate with discretion and efficiency. It was during this time that Sammy began to interact more with John Gotti, a man whose style was almost the opposite of his own. Where Sammy was measured and understated, Gotti was bold and charismatic. Yet, beneath the differences, there was mutual respect. They recognized each other's strengths, and though neither knew it yet, their paths would soon intertwine in ways that would change the course of both their lives. The tension within the family continued to grow. Castellano's leadership style, his focus on certain business ventures, and his perceived detachment from the rank and file created dissatisfaction among some members. Sammy, for his part, tried to maintain his responsibilities without becoming entangled in open disputes. But in the back of his mind, he knew change was coming. It was just a matter of when and how. Outside the organization, Sammy's personal life was also evolving. He had a family, and balancing that with his commitments in the life was no easy task. The demands of the street often clashed with the responsibilities of home, but he did what he could to protect those closest to him from the dangers and stresses of his world. It was a delicate balance, and not one that came with a manual. The mid-1980s were a turning point. Federal investigations into organized crime were intensifying, fueled by the use of RICO laws that allowed prosecutors to target entire organizations rather than individuals. This new legal weapon changed the game. Wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations became constant threats. Sammy adapted again, limiting what he said and where he said it. He operated with the awareness that any room could have ears, any conversation could be recorded. As the decade progressed, the cracks within the Gambino family widened. The growing divide between Castellano and certain factions reached a point where resolution seemed unlikely. Sammy, caught between loyalty to the boss and the realities on the ground, found himself walking a fine line. His respect for structure and order was genuine, but so was his understanding that leadership required more than business acumen. It required connection to the people you led. The relationship between Gotti and Castellano was particularly strained. Gotti, representing a more traditional street-oriented approach, clashed with Castellano's more corporate style. Sammy observed this dynamic closely, recognizing that the outcome would have profound implications for the entire organization. In private moments, he weighed the possible scenarios, knowing that when a move came, it would be decisive and irreversible. Then came the night that would reshape the Gambino family forever. Castellano's assassination outside Sparks Steakhouse in December 1985. Sammy was not directly involved in the hit, but its impact on his life was immediate and far-reaching. The power vacuum it created allowed John Gotti to ascend to the position of boss, a move that would change the internal dynamics of the family dramatically. Gotti's leadership style was a sharp contrast to Castellano's. He embraced publicity, enjoyed the spotlight, and cultivated a flamboyant image that made him a household name. For Sammy, this shift presented both opportunities and challenges. As Gotti's underboss, he would have significant influence, but he also understood that increased attention from the media and law enforcement came with greater risk. Still, the partnership between Gotti and Sammy was effective, at least in the beginning. Gotti's charisma and public presence paired with Sammy's organizational skills and steady hand made for a powerful combination. Together they navigated the complex web of operations, disputes, and external pressures that defined life at the top of one of New York's most powerful families. But as history would show, the same qualities that made Gotti a star in the public eye also attracted the kind of attention that could destabilize everything they had built. For now, though, Sammy remained focused on his role, aware that in this life, nothing was permanent and everything could change in an instant. Sammy sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen that night, the glow from the small lamp over the table casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he didn't care. He wasn't really drinking it anyway. He was thinking about the way things had been, the way they were now, and the way they were heading. In the quiet, he could almost hear echoes of conversations from years past, laughter over drinks, whispers in the corner of a restaurant, low voices in the back of a car. Those voices were mostly gone now, silenced by time, betrayal, or prison walls. But in Sammy's mind, they lived on. The neighborhood outside was still familiar, but it didn't feel the same. Back in the day, every face on the block knew him, respected him, maybe even feared him. Now, many of those faces were gone, replaced by strangers who didn't know his history. The few who did kept their distance, unsure whether to approach or avoid him entirely. That was fine by Sammy. The life he'd lived had taught him that too many people close by was dangerous. Quiet was safer. But quiet also left room for reflection, and reflection brought questions. He remembered the early lessons from his father about working hard and keeping your word. He remembered the shift when success no longer meant steady work and a good home, but rather influence, power, and the ability to control the pieces on the board. That shift had been gradual at first, then all at once, and once he'd stepped into that world, it was impossible to go back. There were moments when Sammy thought about the choices he'd made, the deals struck, the alliances formed, the people he'd trusted. Some choices had brought him further ahead, others had left scars. He had learned that loyalty was often temporary, tied more to convenience than principle. The trick was knowing when someone's loyalty was about to expire and acting before they could turn on you. It was a skill, a survival instinct, and Sammy had sharpened it over the years until it became second nature. One afternoon he was driving through an old part of the city, streets he hadn't seen in years. Brick buildings leaned into the narrow roads and small shops were tucked between aging apartment blocks. He passed an old storefront that used to be a bakery, the kind of place where people stopped in every morning before work. It was boarded up now, the sign faded and peeling. The sight made him think of how much had changed, not just in the streets, but in the very rhythm of the neighborhood. Once, the corner cafe was where you'd hear the day's news, and maybe more than you were supposed to. Now, information traveled differently, and the faces behind the counter were strangers. He thought of his old crew, the men who had stood by him in meetings, who had sat with him in the back rooms where decisions were made. Some of them had been steady and dependable. Others had been unpredictable, wild cards who needed watching. In that life, you couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Sammy had always been good at reading a room, reading a person. It wasn't about what they said. It was about what they didn't say, the way they shifted their eyes, the way they paused before answering. Those little details told you the truth. Late one night, Sammy found himself at a diner on the edge of the city, a place that was open all night and never asked questions. He slid into a booth by the window and ordered a cup of black coffee. The waitress didn't recognize him. To her, he was just another late-night customer. Outside, the streetlights cast a dim orange glow, and the hum of a distant train drifted in through the glass. He liked places like this, neutral ground, somewhere you could think without interruption. As he sipped his coffee, a thought struck him. The hardest part of leaving that life wasn't giving up the money or the influence. It was giving up the sense of purpose. In that world, every day had direction, every move had a reason. Now, without those constant pressures and decisions, the days could stretch out, empty and unstructured. That was dangerous in its own way. Idle time could make you restless, and restlessness could lead you back to places you'd sworn you'd never return. He had to remind himself that the cost of going back was too high. He'd seen what happened to those who couldn't walk away. Some were behind bars, serving out long sentences. Others were gone entirely, remembered only in whispers. Sammy knew he'd been lucky, or maybe just smart enough, to step aside when he did. That didn't mean it was easy. One morning, as the sun was just coming up, Sammy stood by his kitchen window, looking out at the quiet street. A man was walking his dog, bundled against the cold. Across the way, someone was scraping frost from their windshield. Ordinary scenes, safe scenes. He realized that for all the noise and chaos of his past life, there was a certain beauty in the ordinary, Maybe it wasn't the kind of thrill he used to crave, but it was something solid. Still, there were nights when the phone would ring and a voice from the past would be on the other end. Sometimes it was someone looking for advice, sometimes someone fishing for information. He knew better than to say too much. The wrong words could pull you back in faster than you could see it coming. Sammy had made peace with the idea that he would always carry his past with him. It wasn't something you could erase, but he could choose how to live with it. He could choose to keep moving forward, to build something new, even if it didn't look anything like the life he'd once imagined. That choice, to stay out, to stay clear, was one he'd have to make over and over again. And each time it would test him in new ways. But as he sat there, the morning light spilling into the room, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. A quiet confidence that maybe, just maybe, he could keep making that choice. Sammy's life at the heart of the Gambino family became a balancing act that most people outside that world could hardly imagine. On paper, he managed businesses, construction firms that secured city contracts, small restaurants that hired locals, and a handful of legit investments that helped launder cash the old-fashioned way. In practice, he kept a running tally of people to trust, conversations to remember, and favors owed and owed back. Every morning he woke with a list in his head, and every night it followed him to bed like a stubborn companion. The deeper Sammy climbed, the more he realized that power had a peculiar texture to it. It wasn't the headline-making moments. Those were rare and often messy. It was the small, steady things. A contractor who called to say work was going to go smoothly because someone took care of a problem quietly. A union leader who moved a strike threat aside after a polite conversation. A landlord who raised an eyebrow when a rent check arrived on time, even though the building had been troubled for months. Those were wins. They were tidy and invisible, and they kept the family's wheels turning. John Gotti and Sammy made an effective team inside the family. Gotti loved the bold gestures, the public presence, the image, while Sammy preferred the invisible scaffolding that let those gestures stand on something real. Together, they covered each other's weaknesses. Where one drew attention, the other kept the infrastructure steady. It was a partnership that worked because both men understood the other's value and rarely crossed into the other's natural territory. They had a blunt way of speaking to each other that, to outsiders, might have seemed like friction but was more often honest calibration. Still, the world around them pressed in. The federal government was changing how it fought organized crime. No longer content with arresting foot soldiers, prosecutors began aiming for the heads of organizations. Wiretaps, surveillance, financial investigators who followed money instead of footsteps. These were new threats that required new defenses. Sammy's response was to tighten his circle, to compartmentalize operations so that one breach would not ruin everything. He taught his younger men to assume someone was always listening, to carry cash rather than use traceable accounts, to treat meetings like private ceremonies that required ritual-like care. At home, Sammy worked hard to keep the parts of himself that mattered to his family intact. He wanted his children to have a different relationship with him than those who only knew him from headlines. He showed up for birthdays and little league games, for graduations and dinners. He told stories about his father and the way things used to be on the block. Those quiet domestic moments were his refuge, the pause between the acts that required hard decisions. He knew that the life he led could erode those moments quickly, and he guarded them jealously. There were hard lessons learned along the way. Men who had been loyal faltered when the heat got too high. Promises slipped when prison loomed. Sammy learned the difference between people who would bluff in the face of danger and those who would actually go to the mat. It was painful, but he treated it like any other piece of intelligence. Observe, record, respond. He would adjust who he trusted and shift responsibilities to those whose loyalty was proven under pressure, not just in comfortable times. As they consolidated power, the Gambino family's business model grew more sophisticated. They moved beyond the obvious activities and into enterprises that still produced cash, but were harder to trace. Casinos, some legitimate small businesses, and partnerships with people who had clean records. These provided cover. Sammy had a clear eye for where money moved and why. He preferred to keep his hands on the levers that shaped daily flow rather than dream about headlines. The result was a quieter empire, but one that could survive months of scrutiny better than more flamboyant rivals. There were nights when he felt the weight of his choices in his bones. Fame had a way of arriving slowly and then all at once. A name in the paper, a late-night investigator's knock somewhere nearby, a rumble in the neighborhood where people pointed and whispered. He tried to insulate his family, move them to safer neighborhoods, keep different phone numbers, control what reached their ears. But secrecy is porous, and the world recalls what it wants to know. Kids at school asked odd questions. A neighbor saw a car he recognized and pieced things together in the way communities do. Sammy accepted that a past lived in public would not remain private forever. Still, he moved forward with a practical calm. He encouraged younger men to think like business people, to treat crew responsibilities as a job with predictable outcomes and risks to measure. That helped some of them. It didn't help those who wanted glamour and quick money. They burned bright, and the street eventually ground them out. But Sammy treated those failures like case studies, a cautionary tale to tell to others, who wanted to learn how to last rather than how to dazzle. There were moral compromises that never felt quite right. He found himself excusing things in the name of family, of survival, of protecting the people who relied on him. Those excuses worked for a while, then they didn't. Occasionally, a quiet thought would visit. How had he ended up in rooms where men's livelihoods, and sometimes their freedom, hung on the tilt of his decision? He never let that thought fester into indecision. Instead, he let it remind him to be careful, to weigh consequences beyond the immediate ledger. The relationship with John Gotti was complex. Outside the life, it might be summed up as friendship, alliance, or ambition. Inside, it was a daily negotiation. Gotti wanted respect, to be seen, to hold court. Sammy wanted things to run smoothly, to mitigate risk, to keep supply chains managed and money flowing. They complemented each other in ways that made sense until the law tightened its net and put both men in the crosshairs. The higher they rose together, the larger the target became, and that reality reached into family rooms and into the practicalities of day-to-day existence. And then there were the quieter betrayals of time, men who once said they'd die for you but bent when the phone rings and the courthouse looms. Friends who drifted into politics or new businesses and let old allegiances fray. Family members who needed help in ways that exposed them to danger. Watching those shifts, Sammy learned another lesson. Stability came from being adaptable without losing the core of who you were. He taught that to others, though he never quite let anyone in enough to see his doubts in full. As investigations grew louder, conversations in meeting rooms got hushed. Lawyers were consulted not as an afterthought, but as a first line of defense. There were more careful contracts, more shell corporations, and more attention paid to the idea that appearances could be weaponized both by rivals and by prosecutors. The game had grown more technical, less reliant solely on muscle. Sammy adapted, leaning into the legal knowledge and developing relationships with people who could advise on how to make the inevitable scrutiny more bearable. Through all of it, there was a current running under Sammy's days that he couldn't name easily, a quiet worry about longevity. He had seen men fall who thought they were clever. He had seen men win battles but lose the war. The life was glamorous to outsiders because it simplified with color, power, money, respect. But close up, it was a ledger of small choices that layered into big outcomes. He kept telling himself to think 10 steps ahead, an old chess player's habit he'd picked up when life first demanded serious moves at a young age. There were moments of real tenderness, too. Nights spent with his children and grandchildren provided a sense of redemption that many in his world never found. He would sit on a stoop or in a small kitchen and tell stories, not about the heists or the rackets, but about his mother's cooking, the games he played as a kid, the small wins of life. Those were the things that mattered most in the low hours when the city softened and you could hear only your own breath. As the calendar pages turned and the wiretaps and investigations intensified around them, Sammy's decisions started to weigh differently. He was a man living in the middle of two different eras, the old code of loyalty and the new reality of legal pressure and media scrutiny. It made for a complicated calculus. Loyalty, once a clear line, began to look like a variable you adjusted based on the moment, the law, and the safety of those you loved. That shifting ground required temperament, judgment, and sometimes cold detachment. Still, he carried on. He worked, he protected, he advised, and he planned. It was a life measured in details: who to trust, when to pull back, and how to keep the wheels turning while the cameras trained their lens a little closer. The small victories accumulated quietly: a contract secured, a man convinced to stand down, a family meal kept free of outside noise. And in those moments, Sammy felt the narrow satisfaction of a day well managed. He didn't know what the next season would bring. He suspected change. That was now a certainty. But like all serious players, he kept planning in the present while imagining several future paths. That was the craft of survival, the skill that had carried him up through the ranks. And whatever the future held, he resolved to meet it with the same measured focus that had gotten him this far. The tension in the streets was almost invisible to outsiders, but to those living within the world Sammy now navigated, it was as real as the air they breathed. Every meeting, every handshake, every casual conversation carried a weight behind it, an unspoken understanding that power shifted quietly, often without warning. Sammy had been in this game long enough to recognize when the winds were changing, and lately, they seemed to swirl faster than ever. He spent more time observing than speaking, his eyes constantly moving, reading faces, noting the slightest changes in body language. One evening, over a quiet dinner with a trusted associate, Sammy listened more than he talked. The man across from him spoke in circles, offering half-truths and vague references to things in motion. Sammy didn't need the details. The tone alone told him there was a bigger picture he wasn't being fully shown. That never sat well with him. For all the loyalty he had given, he knew that blind trust was a dangerous luxury. At home, things were different, but equally complicated. His family wanted a sense of normalcy, and Sammy wanted to give it to them. He tried to attend dinners, school events, and birthdays, slipping into the role of a regular husband and father. But there was always the shadow of his other life, one that could never fully stay outside the door. His phone would ring at odd hours. A knock at the door could mean a simple delivery or the beginning of something serious. He had learned to compartmentalize, but even the best walls have cracks. It was during one of these family-focused weeks that Sammy got word of a brewing problem. A younger crew, ambitious and impatient, was making moves in areas that were supposed to remain off-limits without permission. It wasn't just about territory, it was about respect. If this challenge wasn't addressed, others might see it as an opening. Sammy knew how these things escalated, slowly at first, then all at once. He arranged a meeting in a neutral spot, a quiet back room of a restaurant where voices could be lowered without losing their impact. The young crew's leader arrived with confidence bordering on arrogance. He spoke quickly, justifying his actions with talk of opportunity and survival in a tough world. Sammy listened, nodding occasionally, but inside he was weighing the man's every word, every pause, every flash of expression. When the man finally stopped, Sammy leaned forward, his voice calm but firm, making it clear that respect and structure weren't suggestions. They were the foundation of everything. The conversation ended without raised voices, but the message was unmistakable. The younger man left with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sammy watched him go, already knowing this wasn't over. In his world, warnings were often the prelude to bigger moves. Days later, as he walked through a familiar neighborhood, Sammy noticed small signs of shifting loyalties. People who once greeted him warmly now gave shorter nods. Conversations would pause when he approached. The change wasn't drastic yet, but it was enough to put him on alert. He began checking in with old friends, reaffirming connections, making sure his allies knew he was still steady, still watching. Behind closed doors, he started mapping out the situation. Who was aligned with? Costs began to press down in ways he couldn't ignore. Business was expanding into different neighborhoods. Sammy oversaw operations that ranged from construction deals to union influence, always making sure things ran smoothly and profit flowed consistently. He had learned to read people quickly, whether it was a city inspector trying to be discreet or a local contractor eager to make money without asking too many questions. In these dealings, Sammy often acted like a diplomat, smoothing over disputes with calm words instead of fists. That was one of his strengths. People respected him because he was fair, but they also understood he wouldn't tolerate being crossed. Despite the money and influence, there was a creeping sense of instability. The old guard of the family was shifting. Younger members eager to prove themselves were sometimes too reckless, and the police presence in certain areas was growing. Sammy knew law enforcement was paying more attention. Surveillance was becoming more sophisticated, and whispers about federal investigations were making their way through the grapevine. He learned to be cautious with his words, even among people he trusted, because trust could be shattered in an instant. At home, Sammy tried to keep his life grounded. He made time for family dinners, celebrated birthdays, and attended school events when he could. His wife and children were a source of pride, and he worked hard to shield them from his other life. But he also knew that the shadows he walked in could never be completely kept away from his doorstep. There were times when the phone rang late at night, and he would have to step outside, knowing his family noticed the change in his voice. He was living two lives, one built on loyalty and power, the other on love and protection, and he was constantly balancing them. Around this time, John Gotti's rise within the Gambino family was becoming more noticeable. Sammy respected Gotti's confidence and charisma, but he also saw the risks in his style. Gotti liked being visible, dressing sharp, showing up at popular spots, and making his presence felt. Sammy, on the other hand, believed in keeping a lower profile. He understood that attention, no matter how glamorous, could be dangerous. The two men would cross paths more often, and their conversations carried a mix of camaraderie and quiet calculation. The street was also changing in other ways. New players were emerging, rival families were adjusting their own moves, and the unwritten agreements that had kept certain peace in place were being tested. Sammy found himself stepping into more meetings, acting as a voice of reason when tempers flared. His calm approach often diffused situations before they could spiral into violence. This skill didn't just protect the family, it protected business, which for Sammy was always the real priority. In the midst of all this, he continued to expand his construction business. Legitimate work provided not only income but also a respectable front, something that could stand up to scrutiny if anyone started asking questions. He made sure his crews were reliable, jobs got finished on time, and payments were made without unnecessary delays. But as much as he tried to keep things clean, the reality was that the influence of the family often helped secure contracts and smooth over problems. It was a balance, walking a line between the appearance of legitimacy and the reality of how things got done. There were moments when Sammy would think about the long term. How long could someone stay in a life like this before the risks outweighed the rewards? He'd seen men retire quietly, but he'd also seen others pulled back in or taken down before they had the chance. He wasn't ready to step away. There was still work to be done, and the sense of loyalty he felt to his people ran deep. But those questions lingered unspoken in the back of his mind. As the decade moved forward, the pressure from law enforcement became more focused. Investigations that had once been vague now had names, faces, and details attached to them. Sammy knew the walls were slowly moving in, and every conversation, every meeting, and every handshake carried a weight it hadn't before. Still, he kept moving forward, maintaining his role as both a protector and an earner, adapting to the changes around him while keeping an eye on the horizon. Sammy's path was never about blind ambition. He wasn't chasing titles or trying to be the loudest voice in the room. His strength came from understanding the game deeply enough to see the moves before they happened, to stay ahead without drawing too much attention. In a world where a single misstep could undo years of work, that was no small feat. But as he was about to learn, the world he navigated was shifting in ways that would soon make even the most careful strategies harder to hold together. By the mid-1980s, Sammy Gravano's position in the Gambino family had evolved into something more complex than just being an earner or a trusted soldier. He had become a steady, dependable figure in an environment where trust was rare and loyalty was tested daily. Every decision he made had a ripple effect on business, on relationships within the family, and on his own future. The streets were always shifting, and staying ahead required a mix of sharp instincts and the ability to adapt without hesitation. The tension inside the family was starting to grow in ways that were hard to ignore. Paul Castellano, the boss at the time, was more focused on business ventures that looked legitimate on the surface, keeping his distance from the day-to-day street activities. To some, that made sense. It reduced exposure to law enforcement, but to others, especially the ones making their living in the neighborhoods, it felt like he was too far removed from the reality of what kept the family strong. Sammy could see both sides of the argument. He respected Paul's ability to think about the bigger picture, but he also understood the frustration of the men who felt left out of those decisions. At the same time, John Gotti was becoming more of a central figure, known for his boldness and his willingness to stand up to authority, both inside and outside the family. He carried himself differently from most, and that visibility made him a magnet for attention. Sammy noticed that Gotti's influence was growing, and so were the whispers about a change in leadership. In the underworld, such whispers were dangerous. They could set off a chain of events that no one could fully control. Sammy's focus remained on keeping his operations strong. His construction businesses were running well, and his reputation for being fair but firm meant people preferred dealing with him rather than risk problems with others. He knew how to keep crews motivated, how to make deals that left everyone feeling like they got something, and how to avoid unnecessary conflicts. This approach earned him respect, not just from his own people, but from outsiders who recognized he was a man of his word. But the world outside the family was tightening around them. Law enforcement had started to use new tools, wiretaps, surveillance teams, and more aggressive investigations. Sammy understood the importance of keeping conversations short, avoiding predictable meeting spots, and never putting too much trust in telephones. Even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone was always watching. It was part of the life, but the level of attention was different now, more focused and determined. The disagreements within the Gambino family came to a head when Castellano's leadership style clashed too much with the street-oriented members. Paul's decision-making sometimes left people feeling disconnected from the core of the organization. To men like Gotti, this was an opportunity. To men like Sammy, it was a sign that change was inevitable. Change in their world didn't come peacefully. It came with planning, alliances, and the kind of decisions that could never be undone. Behind closed doors, alliances began to form. People chose sides, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly. Sammy was not someone who made rash decisions. He took his time, listened more than he spoke, and weighed the risks carefully. He knew that the wrong choice could mean losing everything, not just in business, but in life. His loyalty had always been to the family as an institution, but he also understood that loyalty was a two-way street. If leadership failed to protect the men who kept things running, it risked losing their support. During these months, meetings became more frequent, and conversations grew more pointed. Gotti's name was being mentioned in ways it hadn't before, not just as a captain with influence, but as a potential leader. Sammy could see that Gotti had the charisma to rally people, but he also had the kind of high-profile presence that could bring more heat than the family needed. It was a double-edged sword. Still, when push came to shove, standing still wasn't an option. In their world, indecision was as dangerous as making the wrong move. When the change finally came, it was swift. Castellano was gone, and Gotti stepped into the role of boss. The streets buzzed with the news, and the balance of power shifted overnight. For Sammy, the transition meant stepping into an even more trusted position, Gotti valued him for his ability to get results without creating unnecessary noise, and that trust opened new doors. But it also brought new responsibilities and new risks. As underboss, Sammy now had a bigger say in the family's direction. He was in the room for major decisions, negotiating with other families, and managing the flow of money and influence. The demands were greater, but so were the rewards. He had power, respect, and the ability to shape outcomes in ways he never could before. Yet he never forgot that in this world, the higher you climbed, the further you had to fall. Even as he adjusted to his new role, the heat from law enforcement only intensified. The FBI was making the Gambino family a priority, tracking movements, planting listening devices, and building cases. Sammy had always been careful, but now he had to be even more meticulous. Every meeting was a risk, every phone call a potential trap. He relied on face-to-face conversations, trusted intermediaries, and a strict sense of discipline. Inside the family, not everyone was happy with the new order. Ambition didn't disappear just because leadership changed. In fact, it often grew. Sammy found himself managing not just external threats but internal ones as well. Disputes over territory, money, and influence had to be handled quickly to prevent them from escalating. He often played the role of mediator, finding compromises that kept the peace without undermining authority. Through it all, Sammy remained steady. He knew that survival in this life depended on more than strength. It depended on being able to see 3 steps ahead, to anticipate problems before they landed on your doorstep. He kept his profile as low as possible for someone in his position, avoided unnecessary attention, and focused on results. The new era of the Gambino family was filled with possibilities, but it was also a time when mistakes carried heavier consequences. Sammy could feel the pressure growing, both from outside forces and from the constant undercurrent of ambition within. He had come far, but he knew that every step forward had to be measured, deliberate, and grounded in the understanding that in their world, power was never truly secure. It was borrowed for as long as you could hold it, and one day someone would come to collect. Life on the outside had a strange way of feeling both familiar and foreign to Sammy. The sounds of cars honking, children laughing, and the distant hum of the city felt like echoes from a different life. Yet, every time he turned a corner, he sensed eyes on him, not always visible, but there. He had lived his life in a world where trust was currency, and betrayal could buy your survival. Now, after all that had happened, he wasn't sure which side of that coin he stood on anymore. The days were slower now. No more late-night meetings in dimly lit back rooms, no more coded phone calls, no more checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, though that habit was hard to kill. Sammy found himself walking the same streets he had once dominated in a completely different capacity. Instead of moving through them as a figure of quiet authority, he was now just another man blending into the crowd. But blending in wasn't his style, and deep down, he knew the people who mattered still recognized him. A few familiar faces from the old days would approach him cautiously. Some were curious, others were bitter. A handful were surprisingly warm, though Sammy could never fully tell if their smiles were genuine or calculated. In this world, friendships were complicated, more like temporary alliances than bonds of loyalty. One afternoon, Sammy decided to visit an old neighborhood spot, a small Italian bakery where he used to stop in for coffee and a cannoli. The owner, a graying man named Marco, recognized him instantly. "Sammy," he said, his voice caught between nostalgia and disbelief. "It's been a long time." They exchanged pleasantries, spoke of old times, and avoided certain names. Those names hung in the air like unspoken warnings. Marco leaned closer at one point and said, "Some people still talk about you, you know. Some say you were the smartest man in the room. Others, they say you ruined everything." Sammy took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling the weight of the words. He didn't bother defending himself. He had learned that in certain conversations, silence was more powerful than explanation. But the truth was, Sammy's life had never been simple, even before the headlines and the courtroom drama. He had always operated in a world where choices were rarely between right and wrong. They were between bad and worse. And in that world, survival didn't always make you a hero. It just made you the last man standing. As weeks turned into months, Sammy began focusing on smaller, quieter routines. Morning walks, casual meals at local diners, evenings reading by the window. Yet no matter how normal life appeared, shadows from the past always seemed to stretch just far enough to reach him. A friend of a friend might drop by to say hello, but the questions they asked were never really casual. Do you ever hear from so-and-so? You still keep in touch with anybody? Those questions weren't about reconnecting. They were about measuring his place in the game, seeing if he still had influence. Sammy wasn't interested in going back. At least that's what he told himself. But the truth was, he missed certain aspects of the old life. Not the danger, not the constant paranoia, but the structure. In that life, you knew your role, your purpose, and the rules, even if those rules could shift overnight. Out here, in the so-called normal world, the rules were more subtle, but just as unforgiving. One night, while sitting at a small restaurant near the harbor, he noticed a man watching him from across the room. It wasn't the kind of look you get from someone recognizing you as a celebrity. It was sharper, more deliberate. Sammy met his eyes, and the man didn't flinch. Eventually, the stranger got up and walked out, but not before leaving a small folded napkin on Sammy's table. Inside was a phone number and a simple note. Old friends should talk. Sammy pocketed it without a second thought, but the note burned in his mind the rest of the night. He knew the voice that would be on the other end wouldn't be talking about catching up over dinner. It would be about something else, something that could pull him back in, even if just for a moment. And moments had a way of snowballing. He didn't call. Not that night, not the next. But a week later, after pacing his apartment and replaying the possibilities in his head, he dialed the number. The voice on the other end was low, deliberate, and from a time he thought he'd left behind. The man wanted to meet. Just a conversation, he promised. Sammy knew better than to believe promises, but curiosity was a force he couldn't always resist. The meeting took place in a small park at dusk, the kind of neutral ground where conversations could be both casual and serious. The man, an old associate, spoke about changes in certain circles, new players, old grudges, quiet opportunities. Sammy listened without committing to anything. Still, the conversation planted a seed, a reminder that no matter how far you step away, the past has a way of leaving the door cracked open. Walking away from that meeting, Sammy realized he was at a crossroads. He could shut that door for good, lock it, and throw away the key. Or he could let it stay slightly ajar, just enough to feel the familiar air from the other side. The problem was, in his world, even standing near that door could be dangerous. As night fell, and the city lights reflected off the water, Sammy found himself caught between the man he was trying to be and the man he had always been. And though he didn't yet know which version would win, he knew one thing for certain. In his story, chapters didn't always end when you wanted them to. By the time the weeks rolled into months, Sammy had learned to navigate the delicate balance between asserting himself and keeping a low profile. Every interaction, every meeting, and every casual conversation within the circles he moved in became an opportunity to listen, learn, and read between the lines. His strength was never just in his ability to take decisive action, but in knowing when to hold back and let others reveal themselves. In the life he had chosen, patience was as valuable as courage. New opportunities came disguised as small tasks. Sometimes they were as simple as keeping track of who owed what, making sure certain deliveries arrived where they were meant to, or quietly smoothing over misunderstandings before they turned into bigger problems. Sammy realized that power wasn't always in making the biggest move. It was in being indispensable, the one people knew they could rely on without hesitation. But along with the small victories came challenges that tested his resolve. Rumors floated through the air like invisible threads, each one tugging at someone's trust or reputation. It was a game of whispers, and Sammy understood quickly that survival depended on never letting your name linger too long in those hushed tones. He spoke only when necessary, and never about matters that didn't concern him. He was building a reputation brick by brick, solid, dependable, and unshakable. One evening, at a quiet corner table in a restaurant that seemed to absorb the noise from the street outside, Sammy sat across from a man he had only recently begun to know. This man was well-connected, respected, and careful with his words. Their conversation was more about what wasn't said than what was. It was in the long pauses, the measured nods, and the unspoken acknowledgement that both understood the importance of reading the room. When they finally parted ways that night, Sammy had the sense that a door had quietly opened for him, a door that wouldn't have been there had he pushed too hard too soon. His role in the organization was becoming more defined, though it was still fluid enough to allow him room to maneuver. The older men appreciated his discipline. He didn't seek the spotlight. Instead, he let his work speak for itself. There was something about him that made people feel comfortable, safe even. In a world where everyone was constantly on guard, that was a rare quality. Still, there were times when the weight of his choices settled heavily on his shoulders. The more he became involved, the clearer it was that every decision had ripples that reached far beyond what he could see. He couldn't afford mistakes, but he also couldn't afford to stand still. Progress meant risk, and risk meant knowing exactly when to step forward and when to let someone else take the lead. One of his quiet mentors, an older man with eyes that seemed to see straight through the surface of things, once told him, "The trick, Sammy, is to make yourself needed without making yourself a target." Those words stayed with him. It was advice that could be applied to every situation he found himself in, whether it was a business arrangement, a tense meeting, or simply deciding who to stand beside in a crowded room. Over time, his responsibilities expanded. He was entrusted with handling more delicate matters, situations where trust was paramount and a wrong move could unravel months of careful planning. These moments often came without warning, a simple phone call or a quiet word in his ear that set everything in motion. And each time he proved himself capable, not by drawing attention to what he had done, but by ensuring that the problem simply disappeared without fanfare. There were, of course, moments of doubt. On nights when the city seemed too quiet, when the neon lights cast long shadows across empty streets, Sammy would find himself thinking about the path he was on,